Futuro.
Hey, ITT listener, it's Maria Hinojosa here.
And it's Julio Ricardo Varela here.
Here, and we have a special show for you here today. So, here at ITT, we're all about democracy and voting and being democracy junkies. And just because the 2020 presidential election is over, there are a lot of key local elections happening around the country this year that we're going to be following. And today's show is an interview that you, Julio, did focused on the New York City Manhattan District Attorney's race, right?
Right. You are absolutely correct, Maria. And this is a packed race. So we got to connect with one of the 9 candidates. And here's where I say with utmost clarity, ITT and Futuro do not endorse candidates. So we're doing this, in the interest of public service. It was a chance to get into some of the history of the DA and criminal legal system in New York City. And this interview makes some important connections to conversations we've been having on ITT about racial justice, policing, and abolition.
Okay, so I can't wait to hear this interview. Let's take a listen.
Yay, let's. Hey, welcome to In the Thick, a podcast about politics, race, and culture from a POC perspective. I'm Julio Ricardo Varela, so I'm speaking to a very special guest today. From New York City is Tahani Abushi. She is a civil rights lawyer and a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney. Oh, boy. Hey, Tahani, how are you? Welcome to In the Thick.
I'm great, Julio. Thank you so much for having me.
So, here at the In the Thick, as we say, or at ITT, that's our little acronym, we're all about electoral politics and power. And this year, there are many key elections happening around the country at the local level, which is so important. So we're going to focus on those today, on the elections in New York City. And there are a lot of important races: mayoral race, borough president seats, council member seats. And yes, we'll be discussing today the district attorney races. So let's get a little history here. Since the 1930s, there have been only 4 elected district attorneys in Manhattan.
That's right.
All of them, why am I surprised? I'm not surprised by this.
White male.
Are white men.
Yep.
White men, right?
Since the beginning, not just since the 1930s. Every district attorney of Manhattan has been a white male.
Okay, so everyone. So since back in the day.
Yep.
So here at In the Thick, so that people know, through our New York Women's Foundation Ignite Fellowship, and also throughout this election season, we're actually focusing on local elections and women of color. And so this is one of the reasons why you, Tahani, are on this show today, because if you were to be elected, you would be the first woman, person of color, and Muslim to hold this position, which would make it, without question, a historic feat. You would be taking over Cyrus Vance Jr.'s seat, who has held the title of Manhattan DA for a decade and has been criticized for coming down hard on prosecuting misdemeanors and choosing to not prosecute the likes of Harvey Weinstein and the Trump family members. And it's a crowded DA race. There are 9 candidates, 9, 8 of which are Democrats, including yourself, Tahani. So the Democratic candidates include, and I'm going to list them all. Here we go. Alvin Bragg. He's a former chief deputy attorney general for New York and a former federal prosecutor, and he was endorsed by members of the Exonerated Five.
And I don't think we've had a district attorney who's been both a prosecutor who's worked on our safety, but also has been a civil rights lawyer. I'm running for district attorney at the same time as suing Mayor de Blasio on behalf of Win Carr, Eric Garner's mother.
There are a number of other former prosecutors, including Lucy Lang.
I served this community, Manhattan, as an assistant district attorney, handling the most serious, violent, and complex investigations. And I created a first-of-its-kind college and prison program to bring assistant district attorneys inside New York's prisons to work on criminal justice reform alongside incarcerated New Yorkers.
Tali Farhadi and Weinstein, Diana Florence, and Liz Crotty. Also in the race is public defender Eliza Orlins and State Assemblyman Dan Quart. And the Republican candidate is Thomas Caniff. He's a criminal defense attorney. And some of the most progressive Democratic candidates are looking to transform the DA's role. And Tahani, you are also one of those candidates with a progressive platform.
Right.
So as a civil rights attorney, You won a class action settlement in 2018 on behalf of Muslim women forced by the New York City Police Department to remove their hijabs from mugshots. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
We also know that your personal experiences with the criminal legal system go back to your teenage years when your dad was sentenced to over 2 decades in a federal prison for a nonviolent offense. Tahani, talk to us about your background. What inspired you to run for Manhattan DA? And how do you stand out in such a crowded race?
Yeah, I mean, these are big questions. And I'll start by saying, this is an office of immense power and impact, unlike any other office here in New York City. I mean, we're talking about the future of our Black and Latino communities, our communities of color as a whole. And this is one office with just an immense amount of discretion, a large budget, a large workforce. And it goes largely unchecked. And it operates in a very opaque manner. Mm-hmm. And for me, I'm not a fan of those kind of structures, especially those that can really infringe on our rights,
right.
That can destabilize our communities, that can make decisions on behalf of people. And these decisions impact us, our opportunities and obstacles for generations to come. And I'm a prime example of that. When I was 14 and my father was sentenced to 22 years in prison, my mother essentially became a single parent to 10 children. Wow. My youngest sibling was 6 at the time. And this happened in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And let me give you a little background about my family.
Sure.
I am the child of Palestinian immigrants. My parents, my mom ended up coming from Palestine and settled in Detroit. My dad came from Palestine, settled in New York. They ended up meeting. My mom chose the better state, came here with my father, and they had a small grocery store in El Barrio in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. So both of my parents and almost all of my siblings are actually fluent in Spanish because of predominantly Hispanic neighborhood.
That's like
crazy, right?
You already said El Barrio.
Yeah.
You already rolled the R's. But, I'm from Puerto Rico, so, Palestinians and Boricuas, there's a history, so.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And so, we had a small grocery store. Everybody worked there. We stocked shelves on the weekends. It was a heavy immigrant community. And then when my father's trial happened, we were uprooted. We had to leave our home, our neighborhood, closed down the store, left our schools. And there was a moment in the trial where the judge finally asked the prosecutor the question on my mind. He asked her, what are you going to do with all these kids? And without hesitating, she said, they're not my problem. And she just kept it moving. And I was really struck by the imbalance of power in that courtroom and how we were at the mercy of the prosecutors and the judge and this jury. And life as we knew it was over. And we didn't no idea what our future would look like. That didn't sit right to me. And it inspired me to become a lawyer, a civil rights attorney, to come stand by families like mine, because there are thousands of families that share my story, but we can never talk about it. And we just have to navigate these obstacles to fight against becoming a statistic that says we should be thrown away and shoved into the shadows of society, hoping our voices would be forgotten. We can't let that happen.
As a journalist who covers immigrant communities and Latino communities, that's one of the things that drives me as a journalist. There's humanity behind the voiceless. And
Right.
I think a big part of your platform in that vein, especially in this context where we are right now in 2021, is protecting immigrants.
Yes.
You said during the Trump administration's Muslim ban that it was personal for you as a child of Palestinian immigrants and as a Muslim. So you led, this is like, I think I remember you doing this because, I was covering this. You led a legal team to JFK Airport when the ban was implemented in Trump's first days of office in January of 2017.
Yeah.
And as we said, right, it's not just the Trump administration. There is inhumane, and we talk about this a lot on In the Thick, inhumane immigration policy is not unique to the Trump administration. It was enabled by decades of bipartisan policy. We're seeing it play under the Biden administration. Just one example is families are still being expelled at the border under Title 42,
Right.
which is a public safety act that allows officials to literally send back immigrants, which Trump invoked during the coronavirus pandemic. But then recently in New York State, a historic $2.1 billion fund for COVID-19 relief was passed for undocumented workers. But there's still all these other concerning policies when it comes to policing and immigrant communities, like the NYPD using AI technology, face recognition tools, which disproportionately target people of color. And of course, we know that mass incarceration in this country also targets and criminalizes the immigrant community. And there's a lot of talk about New York City is a city safe for immigrants, but you look at that policy sometimes and, there's platitudes and then there's policy. So how will you make sure New York City is safe for immigrants and also make sure that decarceration also includes immigration policy?
I think that's a very important question. And for me, I'm all about getting to the root cause of things, getting to the issue, making these structural changes. I don't do patch jobs. I don't cut corners. I don't evade that responsibility. And I feel like the district attorney's office has skirted a lot of those responsibilities and has limited its obligations to just this knee-jerk automation of prosecution and incarceration. Right. I dissect those decisions as a civil rights attorney. I dissect that interaction between police and civilians and wrongful convictions, malicious prosecutions, false arrests, false imprisonments, excessive force. And for me, what's important is to ensure several things. One, that we change our mindset on what is the role of a prosecutor, what is the role of the district attorney's office. And for me, it must be a partner with community-based organizations to ensure that we're accomplishing public stability. Public safety to me is public stability, and you're not going to get that without public participation. In regards to just your immigration question.
No, but that's interesting. Before you get on to your next point, because the way you just framed that, public safety, say that again, because I've never...
Yeah, public safety to me means public stability, and we're not going to get there until we have public participation in the process.
So basically what you're saying is, you have to have trust. People need to participate. They can't be in fear. This is a safety issue, like immigrant, right? Is that what you're saying?
It's a safety issue, right? But when you think about public safety, right, you have to think about what do people need, right? People need housing, education, employment, stability, immigration status, stability, work, things that allow them to put food on the table and advance themselves and meaningfully participate in society. So instead of criminalizing the struggle, right, we're saying invest resources, help people along, help give a hand instead of pointing a finger. And the second part of it is if we're going to prevent crime, then we need our community-based organizations. We need our community leaders who know the neighborhoods, know the families, know who's walking down the street, where the kids go to school, where the parents work, so that we can build that trust. We can open that line of communication. Our immigrant community, documented or not, are some of the most vulnerable here because they're afraid to speak up when they're victims of crimes, whether it's wage theft, notarios, unsafe working conditions, or any variations of crime. I mean, their status makes them nervous to move forward, make them afraid of revenge prosecutions. And then we're expecting them to just walk into a precinct in that environment and just talk freely about their status, and then to be in a prosecutor's office and to talk freely about the instability of their status. I mean, let's think about the human side of what that process looks like and how terrifying it is. So the way to alleviate that is not to say, hey, prosecutors and police are nice people, let's play basketball together. Yeah. It's to say, who do you trust in your community that can help us open that line of communication so you know that you're safe and we can still help you.
I want to move on to the topic of the criminal legal system, and to kind of frame this part of the discussion, wanted to share latest statistics from the Brennan Center saying that more than 40,000 New Yorkers around the state are behind bars, and more than 300,000 have spent time in prison at some point in their lives. That is just a mind-boggling number. In New York City, we have seen a drop in the number of people behind bars due to COVID-19, but there's still over 5,000 people in jails across the city, and that's according to the Division of Criminal Justice Services. And we know that the majority of folks are Black and brown people. We see this throughout the system with the ongoing police brutality and murders of Black people and people of color, and higher incarceration rates for our communities. So we have to ask ourselves, who does the criminal legal system benefit? Our producer, Harsha Nahata, spoke with Nicole Smith-Futrell, who's an associate professor and supervising attorney in the Criminal Defense Clinic at the CUNY School of Law, who talked about the devastating impacts of incarceration on New Yorkers and what she hopes to see from DA candidates.
We've had so many decades of really punitive prison sentences and punishment for people. And I think it's really important for us not only to look at, the front end aspect of the system, but also the back end. How do we get all of the people who are languishing in state prisons, have been put there under a certain approach or mindset to the criminal legal process that we are slowly moving further and further away from? I think that's really important too. So, I'm particularly interested for many of these DA candidates to understand what their position is on parole reform, and changing the opportunities for people to be able to, see the light of day. Many folks who have been in prison, who have long been rehabilitated, who, would serve a lot of good back out in the community, but are languishing in prison. I think I would really love to know what a lot of the DA candidates plan to do about that, and about, clemency for, the governor, this power that the governor has to have people who've been serving long sentences and have really no other recourse to be released. I would love to see a little bit more traction on that. So it's definitely the front end of the system, but it's also the back end. How do we decarcerate by just getting people out, people who really don't have any other sort of means or opportunity to get out? I think that's really important.
So, Tahani, part of your vision for Manhattan DA includes decarcerating communities of color and ending death by incarceration. So what are your thoughts on Nicole's comments here? And talk to us about your vision and plan if you were to be elected DA. How can you build equity and justice within a racist and honestly unjust system?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. Parole reform is a huge issue, one that I support. It's an opportunity for early release, for people to actually focus on rehabilitation and be rewarded for it and be released early. I've put a sentence cap of 20 years because we know that year 20 is no different than year 21. And people are aging in prisons faster, and their health is deteriorating. And actually, our prison system has been dubbed the highest security nursing home in the world because we've put people away for so long.
Wow.
That a lot of the budget is for palliative care. I am still committed to establishing a sentencing review unit that goes back and looks at people who are sentenced to jail or prison for charges that are on my decline to prosecute list, for those who are incarcerated for more than 20 years. And we're going to have an open line of communication with the defense bar to join in motions to vacate long sentences, to reduce sentences for those who have health issues and are immunocompromised. Because one of the things, Julio, that I think was the silver lining of the pandemic is that it really forced us to rethink the structures of agencies that we've been told were just too big, too powerful, and too much to change. From our school system to the criminal justice system, from our court system to incarceration, everybody had to get back to the drawing board and operate in a perspective of what was absolutely necessary.
Right.
And we saw that a lot of district attorneys started to decline these low-level offenses, decline to put people in prison, whether it was pretrial detention or afterwards. And there was a real focus on controlling the jail and prison population because why? We saw it from a public health perspective. That's something we can't lose sight of. And we can't let these policies be temporary. We have to make them permanent. And I think that's going to be an important way to start tackling not only decarceration, but also to decriminalize communities of color and the way of life.
Yeah. And, one of the things that strikes me, because when we started this conversation and, history hits me like a couple, minutes after, and I'm like, so all white men as DAs, and thinking about New York City and liberal New York City or liberal Manhattan, how much is that a challenge in all this as well? Because we have seen a history of the city, right? Literally having, well-intentioned white liberals create essentially, for lack of a better word, and I'm not exaggerating here, because I have the data to back it up, whether it's stop and frisk or other, examples, that it's literally a police state.
Right.
How do you look at that as a woman of color in a place that is so quote unquote liberal?
Yeah, Manhattan is kind of liberal. I think it's honestly still a very much segregated borough, both by race and by income. And I think that to be progressive and to be left is easier in other topics. But when it comes to criminal justice reform and to tackle topics like violent crimes and safety and accountability, people get nervous and they feel like they need to default to that tough on crime, prosecute and convict at all costs. We need the police for everything. And it's just not true. And the way I wean people off of that is I say, look, here in New York City, we have 5 district attorney offices, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the AG's office, the Office of the Special Narcotics Prosecutor. We have the largest law enforcement agency in the country, over 30,000 members, $11 billion budget, but they're telling us crime is still rising. There are billions of dollars pumped into this carceral system, and it hasn't eradicated crime. And you don't feel any more safe because of all that money. So how can we continue to do the same thing over and over and expect a different outcome? We have to have other alternatives. We have to have other tools available to us to address the root causes, to clear out low-level offenses and social inequities, and actually have resources, get people on their feet, take those billions of dollars, put it back into the communities so that we can ensure stability. And then that will allow us to clear so much space and resources to actually focus on more serious crimes, like our rise in shootings and our homicides and our rapes and sexual assaults, because the clearance rates for those crimes are still pretty low. They barely hit 50%.
Hey, it's Julio here, and you know it in the thick. We talk a lot about how the media world is broken, right? We see all this divisive content that tends to polarize people and then they go into their little bubbles. There's this app called Ground News that is trying to at least rebuild how we should be looking at media in the first place. Because in the end, all media is biased. And at least what Ground News does, it takes all its sources from over 50,000 outlets from across the world and the political spectrum. And then you can see, how this story is filtered. You can come to your own conclusions as a reader. Ground News is what I want the future of news media to be because it keeps you informed no matter your politics. So click on the link in the show description, go to ground.news/thick to download the free Ground News app.
Hey, it's producer Harsha here, and let me tell you, I've really struggled to find the motivation to work out this year. Lots of things can make your workouts hard, but your socks shouldn't. Bombas Performance Socks are built to be nothing but comfortable and supportive. They have this pillow-like cushion that'll save you from blisters and temperature-regulating vents that allow cool air to flow in and prevent overheating. They're so soft, they feel like they're hugging my feet, and they're the reason that I look forward to working out now. And like all of their socks, for every pair of Bombas Performance Socks you buy, they donate a pair to someone in need. They've donated over 45 million pairs so far. So go to bombas.com/inthethick today and get 20% off your first order. That's BOMBAS, bombas.com/inthethick for 20% off.
Okay, so we want to turn to one key part of your platform, which folks in New York City have been advocating for years, and that's the decriminalization of sex work.
Yes.
This past February, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo repealed the discriminatory anti-loitering statute, or what's been known as the, quote, walking while trans law. And now the DAs in all the 5 boroughs have worked to dismiss cases from this stop and frisk type of statute, and we're seeing action on other laws that have been used to criminalize the sex worker community.
Right.
Of course, all this comes after years of LGBTQ advocacy, and at the end of April, Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. also asked a judge to dismiss an additional I think about like 900 additional cases related to prostitution and unlicensed massage. Decrim NY, which is an organization working towards decriminalizing and destigmatizing sex work, put out a statement saying that this move to dismiss prosecuting some sex workers is progress, but that overall the state needs to do more to decriminalize sex work since DAs change, and so this progress could be temporary. They also point out that choosing not to prosecute does not equate to decriminalizing sex work, and that police will continue to interact with sex workers, which can often be dangerous. So, Tahani, can you talk about the importance of decriminalizing sex work and poverty, right, to protect the most vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think this is such an important issue, and it's great that the Manhattan District Attorney is finally catching up to things, but he has to go further. And I'm hoping under my administration, if we win, that we're going to run with this and fully decriminalize sex work. And to decriminalize sex work means to remove the criminal penalties from this consensual engagement between adults. And this allows for the freedom of sex workers to negotiate their terms, to ensure fair treatment for those who are abused, for them to have access to making police reports or coming to the district attorney's offices and not being in fear that they will be criminalized and arrested. And this is completely different from the Nordic model, which still criminalizes solicitation. So we're cutting all of that out. And remember, this has nothing to do with human trafficking. There are separate charges. There are separate efforts on that front. Everybody supports that interruption. Yeah. That's not the same as sex work. And I always tell people, for sex work, if money was not exchanged, we wouldn't be talking about it. Because we live in that free society where consenting adults can have sex and no one intrudes. The government doesn't intrude. But when it comes time to an exchange of money, there are a lot of these low-level misdemeanors that don't make anybody safe, make the lives of sex workers harder, and then allows for harassment by the NYPD Vice Unit, which we also need to disband. Some of the most horrific abuses out of that Vice Unit is a result of their fabricated attempts of saving victims, interfering or catching traffickers. And the truth is, they don't do any of that there. They do assault and harass sex workers. So we need to fully decriminalize sex work. We need to disband the NYPD Vice Unit.
We also have to address, you mentioned police. Let's talk a little bit about policing in the city and across the country. Full disclosure, it's what I tell people all the time. I come from a family of cops on my mom's side, and my stepdad was a New York City homicide detective. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in cop culture when I moved from Puerto Rico to the Bronx. So I could write a book about it. I mean, in the 70s and the 80s, and now I'm looking back at it. But, New York City, like you said earlier, has one of the largest and oldest police departments in the country. But like you also mentioned, we know that police officers do not keep us safe, particularly in communities of color. We've talked on this show about how police systems are rooted in slave patrols and how police and prison reform aren't enough, right? Last year, we actually interviewed Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman, who has endorsed you, Tahani, and he spoke about how policing doesn't make him feel safe. When Maria and I had him on, we admired him so much for sharing his story. So this is what Congressman Bowman had to say last year when he wasn't congressman, when he was running.
The issue of police reform, you're right, is going to be a fight. And, it's not just, it's the defunding that's part of it, but the reallocating of resources toward a new conversation around public safety and public health. And, in early September, Elizabeth Warren, Ayanna Pressley, and Barbara Lee introduced policy that looks at racism as a public health crisis. And that's where we have to move Joe Biden and others so that they understand that, look, it's not just police reform, it's institutional racism. It lives in every fabric of American life. And if we take a public health approach, then we can look differently at policing in our communities. And the last thing I would say is this, and I tweeted this the other day. Police have never made me feel safe. I don't feel safe because of police. I feel safe because of my family, my home, having food on the table, having a job with health insurance and dignity, and living amongst good people who are well educated and seeking more education and connection. That is what keeps us safe, not more police in the street.
So, and obviously just a few weeks ago, we saw the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
But we know these are rare instances. For example, since 2005, only 8 police officers have been convicted of murder, despite 139 officers being arrested for murder or manslaughter for on-duty shootings, and that's according to Vox. So, 8 out of 139 officers in 16 years. So, Tahani, you vowed to cut the Manhattan DA's $169 million budget in half. And last year, during the national uprising against racist policing, you called out the NYPD on Twitter. I remember this, for their brutality towards protesters, saying they were, and I'm quoting from you, from your tweet, grossly unnecessary, excessive, and a waste of much needed funds. So, Tahani, where do you stand on the defund the police movement? And if elected, how do you begin to build trust between your office and communities of color?
Well, look, let me say, Congressman Jamal Bowman hit it right on the head. We've seen a spike in hate crimes across the city, and people keep saying we need more enhancements, we need more police, we need more things. And I say, look, as a Palestinian Muslim woman, I'm no stranger to hate. I'm no stranger to hate crimes. And I've never been able to report them. I've never looked at a police officer and said, I feel safe around you, or I feel like you can do something about it, because it's hate. It's a mindset. It's not something police or prosecution or incarceration is going to do anything about, especially not when you have a former president banning Muslims from the country. So we got to get to the root. I think that for the NYPD, we have to reduce that budget. We have to have alternatives to policing. And let me tell you something, Julio.
Yeah.
The NYPD union agrees. Pat Lynch, the union head at the height of the pandemic, said something I thought was just profound. He said, every time a city agency fails, you throw police at it. And he also said that the NYPD has more contact with New Yorkers than any other city agency. And those two statements are precisely the problem. We cannot continue to force the NYPD to be a gap filler for agencies that we've defunded. We've cut the Department of Education budget. We've cut social services. We cut the summer youth employment program. We've cut art from the classrooms, music, extracurricular activities. Our parks barely get funding. And I sit on Community Board 10 here in Harlem. So I see where the money goes and where it doesn't go and where it's cut. And so, this is an opportunity to restructure, and all of the agencies are going through rebudgeting, and the NYPD shouldn't be off limits. We need community partnerships. We need to invest in our crisis management systems. We need to invest in schools, job training, mental health services, substance use disorder programs that actually address the root causes of these instabilities and alleviates them. And we can do that by taking some of that $11 billion budget and spreading the wealth elsewhere.
Yeah, the point you made, I thinking about it, because everyone's like, oh, the police union. I come from a police union family, so I'm trying to be open about it when I talk about policing, especially as a journalist. But the point that you made about the union, it's almost like a politically realistic move, right? I know it's like you're grounded in racial and social justice, but when it comes to trying to get change, there's a political transaction here. Cops saying, I don't want to do this could open for change, right? I mean, is that a way?
It absolutely is. I mean, that's how we got the pilot program, where we finally, the public advocate had introduced the program where we said, look, majority of the calls to 911 dispatched to police are traffic issues, whether it's traffic infractions or accidents, and then calls of what they call emotionally disturbed persons, EDPs, which are mental illness crises, right? And they don't know what's going on. They lump everybody as EDPs. And these are the type of cases that I work on when I focus on excessive force. And I've deposed dozens of officers over the last 10 years. I know their patrol guide. I know their training. I get into their minds in these depositions because this is how you make that structural change. It's not about fancy tweets that go viral. It's about understanding how these things tick. And for me, that's the important part here, is to say, look, this is not working. Officers don't want to be responding to this. No amount of training is going to help them understand the circumstances they're going into. And they're people at the end of the day. It's still uncertain territory and sometimes even scary. And so the public advocate proposed this program where for cases of mental illness, that there will be a team of social workers with officers on standby if they're needed to address these circumstances. And that's a result of this finally admission, right, by law enforcement, by the union to say, we're not good at this and we shouldn't be doing this. We can be here as backup. Yeah. And so that program, that pilot is going to be kicking off here in New York City. There's another program where a few blocks in Brooklyn, the local precinct agreed to back off on a couple of blocks and let the community leaders handle all the issues that were going on. And after a couple of weeks, they had only one 911 call, and I think it was for somebody that was lost, Julio.
Wow.
Yeah. Otherwise, the community was engaging with the leadership. And so these pilot programs are so important because it lets us, scale up. Let's see if we can do this wholesale. Let's see if we can really reserve law enforcement for absolutely necessary interactions instead of being the catch-all for everything going on in our city.
Okay, so let's move on to our final segment, which in Spanish, since you might know this, because you said, growing up, it's called Sin Pendejadas, or basically no bullshit. So, so there you go. That's
you can say that.
I know, I said it, but you don't have to. But yeah, you got it. So, In the Thick has been talking about abolition when it comes to combating these racist systems of policing and prisons. So, and Tahani, you've actually tweeted, this is what you said: restorative justice and alternatives to incarceration should be the rule, not the exception for all communities. So, sin pendejadas, no bullshit. Where does restorative justice fit, or does it, within the abolitionist perspective in your eyes?
Oh, it absolutely fits, because restorative justice allows the party to focus on healing, not on punitive measures, harming, outdoing the harm that was done. It centers the voice of the victim. It understands that those who do harm have been harmed themselves, and it's an opportunity for real rehabilitation. Because the abolition movement, which I hope we get to, we hope society gets there, is to move away from policing and move towards a society where people can correct that harm, people can address it, and we can have accountability that looks beyond just prosecution and incarceration.
So listen, before I outro you, I'm just curious what your favorite word in Spanish is.
Oh, it's inappropriate. If I'm gonna be honest.
We will leave it with that. Tahani Abushi, candidate for Manhattan District Attorney and civil rights lawyer. Thank you so much for joining me on In the Thick.
Thank you so much for having me, Julio.
I'm Julio Rigalo Varela, and this episode, for Second One, was produced by our New York Women's Foundation Ignite Fellow, Lisa Salinas. Texas forever, Lisa. Texas forever. And remember, go to Apple Podcast to rate and review us, because it really, really helps. And we do read every review and we chat about it. And we love the latest reviews. You guys are all fabulous for sharing that. You can also listen to In the Thick on Pandora, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on the webs, on the internets at inthethick.org. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at In the Thick Show. Like us on Facebook, and tell all your friends about In the Thick. In the Thick is produced by Nicole Rothwell, Noor Saudi, Harsha Nahata, Lisa Salinas, and our intern, Nicole Basolino. Our audio engineering team, all women, all stars, Stephanie LeBeau, Julia Caruso, and Leah Shaw. They make us sound so good. Thank you, team. And our digital editor is the fabulous Luis Luna. And the music you heard is courtesy of Nacional, Kept, and ZZK Records. We will see you next time. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, y'all. Bye.
The opinions expressed by the guests and contributors in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Futuro Media or its employees.